Star Trek has always been one of my favorite entertainment franchises. I was literally raised on Star Trek. I was watching The Next Generation with my mom when I was 2 years old, and my elementary school nights always consisted of lying in bed and watching Voyager at 10 p.m. on UPN 48 as I went to sleep. My middle school days were filled with, in addition to RuneScape, LAN games of Star Trek Armada and Star Trek Armada 2, and online matches of Star Trek Bridge Crew and Star Trek Voyager Elite Force. Then, in the mid-2000s, Star Trek gaming just sort of died off. We got a few games after that. The super okay Star Trek Legacy on Windows and 360, the painfully generic game simply titled Star Trek and based on the J.J. Abrams Abomination movie, and most recently Star Trek Resurgence, which is actually a really solid choice-based adventure game. That was a good one. But other than Resurgence, nothing has really felt like it captured the spirit of Star Trek in the past 20 years. I guess I forgot about Star Trek Bridge Crew on PSVR. That was also a good one. However, that drought ended, or at least changed, when Star Trek Voyager Across the Unknown dropped in February 2026. This budget-priced indie game, $40 for the base game and $50 for the deluxe edition that includes DLC, adding a few new missions and 2 new recruitable heroes, perfectly captures not only the feel of Star Trek generally, but of Voyager specifically in a way that not even Elite Force's single-player campaign really did. Across the Unknown is a semi-roguelite adventure/management sim. You guide Voyager and her crew through the 7-season series' most iconic missions and encounters, with Tim Russ and Robert Duncan McNeil reprising their roles as Tuvok and Tom Paris, respectively. And your choices in the game dramatically impact which ending you get and your gameplay along the way. There's one ending, which is the first one I ended up getting, that has Voyager return to Earth, thus completing the game in like 10 minutes. There's also an ending that takes you right up to the events of the series finale in Season 7, and can easily take 15 hours to get. What makes the game so compelling, despite having relatively simple gameplay, once you get a feel for the resource management, is that it provides players a chance to ask what-if questions about decisions that Captain Janeway made. What if Janeway had used the Caretaker Array to send Voyager back to Earth in the first episode, instead of destroying it to save the Ocampa? What if Janeway had chosen not to ally with the Borg against Species 8472 in the 2-part episode Scorpion, the best episode of the entire series, in my opinion? You get to make different choices in those pivotal moments than Captain Janeway did in the series. The consequences of those choices might end your game, for good or ill, right then and there. They might come back to haunt you, or help you, 5 hours later. That's the kind of agency that Resurgence first gave Star Trek players, but that Across the Unknown applies to established canon events, something that I find infinitely compelling, and that adds an enormous amount of replay value. The semi-roguelite aspect comes into play with the star systems in each sector and available resources. The planets you can visit and what resources they have to harvest are procedurally generated and different in each playthrough. The gameplay is largely split into 3 parts. The part you'll spend the most mental energy on is the management sim aspect. When Voyager is thrown 75,000 light-years away into the Delta Quadrant by the Caretaker, the ship is left an absolute wreck. Most of the ship has lost life support. In the game specifically, it wasn't quite that catastrophic in the show. And you have to spend your precious scarce resources rebuilding the ship deck by deck, starting with life support for each deck, and then clearing out debris from ruined rooms and rebuilding rooms. Be careful though, because all rooms have an energy cost, and if you exceed the amount of energy your warp core can produce, rooms will automatically shut down, which can have disastrous consequences on your defenses and on crew morale. You have to make sure that you're upgrading your warp core so that you can increase the power level. The warp core can be upgraded up to level 6, but that requires research, which is done in a science lab. The more science labs you have, the faster you accrue research points. You also need deuterium to power the warp core, and this is arguably the most important resource in the entire game, because it's an instant game over if you run out of deuterium, because without it, Your engines can't function and take you to new planets to harvest more. You'll also need to manage your food. The 3 ways to feed your crew is with emergency rations, which doesn't use a resource but has a huge hit to crew morale, the standard rations, which uses food and keeps your morale pretty stable, and replicator rations, which uses extra deuterium but gives a good boost to crew morale. That can be a precarious balance, because having no morale for too long is game over, but running out of deuterium, also a game over, happens a lot faster if you're using replicator rations to boost morale. The other resources you'll need, in order from most commonly used to least commonly used, are geranium, used for repairs as well as crafting and building and upgrading rooms, tritanium, used for room construction and research, biogel packs used for upgrading rooms, Borg nanites used for researching Borg technology as well as building and upgrading Borg rooms, and dilithium used for warp jumps and research. It can be difficult to juggle all of these resources, especially biogel packs and Borg nanites, which have to be crafted with a specific room rather than harvested from planets and encounters, but it's crucial for success. You also have to juggle crew size. If you don't have enough crew members, you can't operate all of your rooms. Crew morale, science points for research, and food, but those are the more obvious. What you'll come to find is that the biggest limiter isn't the resources to build an upgrade, but the space on the ship for rooms. You need cargo bays, so you have enough storage capacity to stockpile resources, especially food and deuterium. You need crew quarters to house your crew. Emergency quarters hurt morale, but house a lot of people. Officers' quarters don't house many at all, but boost morale. And then crew quarters fall right in the middle. Using all emergency quarters will save you space on the ship, but using all officer quarters will give you a big morale boost. You'll need a hydroponics bay to produce food, and a biolab to produce biogel packs and Borg nanites. You'll want combat rooms, phaser control rooms, torpedo control rooms, shield generators, disruptor control rooms, and Borg cutting beam control rooms to increase your combat prowess. You'll want batteries to store excess energy, which can be used if you run low on deuterium. You'll want engineering offices to repair the ship and build rooms, and you'll want science lab to get more research points. Having spent far too much time talking about the management sim part of the gameplay, let's move on. The second part of gameplay is the in-system travel and exploration, where you'll scan planets for harvestable resources and complete main and side missions. Side missions are extremely easy to miss, depending on the choices you make. I automatically failed one mission at the very beginning because of the very first choice I made for it. This adds a bit of uniqueness to each playthrough, so I don't actually mind it. A lot of these missions will involve flying between planets or between systems in a sector, but sometimes you'll have to send your heroes, the named characters from the show, on away missions. These are essentially like the old text-based adventure games, where it tells you what's happening, and you have to make a choice of how to deal with it. Depending on what heroes you choose, these missions could be super easy or brutally difficult. Each hero has a specialized trait. Tom Paris has the pilot trait, for example, and Chakotay has survivalist. And these are sometimes necessary to make a certain choice. Sometimes it's based on species. You'll need Neelix or Kess on the team if you want to select a choice that requires Talaxian or Ocampa, respectively. Most choices, though, are based on your skills. Engineering, combat, science, medicine, diplomacy, and whatever the Starfleet icon represents. I don't remember what that's supposed to be. Starfleetness, I guess, whatever. If your skill is high enough, and sometimes you can have two characters pool their points in one certain skill to pass that threshold, you'll be granted success. If your skill exceeds the necessary level, you'll have a chance of critical success, which yields additional resources. If your skill is below that level, you still have a chance of success, but the more the task level succeeds your level, the higher the risk of failure is. Failure sometimes means a bad outcome for the entire mission, it sometimes means an injury for a hero, and sometimes it means a hero's death. The third and final part of the gameplay, the least common part, but the most exciting in my opinion, is combat. When you're in combat, whether it's a random ambush or a scripted battle, you're taken to a screen where you see Voyager from a third-person perspective, and the ship or ships that you're fighting. This doesn't play like a flight combat sim, though. You'll select a specific part of the enemy ship to attack, say weapons, shields, warp core, whatever, and your ship will automatically fly to aim at that part of the enemy vessel with phasers, disruptors, and Borg cutting beams firing automatically. Their fire rates depend on how many control rooms you have, what level those control rooms are, and if you have heroes assigned to them to boost their effectiveness. Photon torpedoes are fired manually with L2, and those get their power boosted by different control rooms. You can also choose 3 heroes to equip, for lack of a better word, before each battle, each with their own ability. My favorite selection was Tuvok for his phaser burst, Chakotay for his maneuverability and damage boost, and a character I won't outright name to avoid potential spoilers, for their stackable ability to boost weapon damage. I ended up having Voyager so overpowered that I destroyed the Borg Queen's tactical cube at the very end of the final sector without ever having my shields drop. Having more control rooms to boost your power means that you divert more power to that particular system, whether it's a weapon or shields. Energy is manually allocated in combat, and you can take power away from one system and divert it to another up to that system's maximum at will. This maximum can be increased by building more control rooms. For example, I had so much shield power from my 3 level 3 shield generators that, except for the last fight with the Borg Queen, I ended up taking a lot of energy away from my shields and putting it into my phasers and disruptors. If your enemy shields go down but still have a lot of hull strength, you could take power away from phasers, which are most effective for draining shields, and divert it to your Borg cutting beams if you've built any, which do very little damage to shields but are devastating against an unshielded hull. Visually, the game looks like you'd expect for an indie game in a relatively niche IP. It looks fairly good, but it's not going to impress anyone. Sound design is great, though. The ambient sounds of the warp core when you're in the ship view perfectly captures the feel of a starship, and the phaser and photon torpedo sound effects are perfect. Character models do look a little off. I don't really know how else to describe it, but it's not to the point where you'll ever have trouble recognizing a character from the show. This is definitely an example of placing function over form. The game may not have dazzling graphics and full voice acting, but the gameplay is addictive and fun, and the game has a ton of replay value, given all the branching paths and certain degree of RNG luck. Star Trek Voyager Across the Universe is the ultimate love letter to Voyager fans. It manages to stay faithful to the ship's encounters in the show, while taking enough creative liberty to make choices significant and impactful, even when they divert from what Captain Janeway chose to do in the show. Even if you've seen the entire Voyager series numerous times like I have, there's still something new to experience here depending on your choices. It definitely looks like an indie game, and the relatively slow pace of the game fits in with a lot of indie games, but the quality of the narrative choices, especially if you're a fan of Voyager, far surpassed what I expected from an indie game. And the price tag is fair for an indie game lacking the polish and pizzazz of a AAA title. If you're a Star Trek fan, you absolutely must download this game. If you're a general sci-fi fan, or just like a good story where your choices change the ending, you should at least check out this game to see if it's something you think you might enjoy enough to buy. Either way, this game might not be a masterpiece, but it's the kind of Star Trek game that many of us fans have been craving for decades. My rating for Star Trek Voyager Across the Unknown for Switch 2, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and PC is an A.